All right, diving in, got the source material right here, ready to unpack some really potent ideas.
Yeah.
We're looking at excerpts from thinkchat15.pdf today, and the focus is on these internal barriers that can, seriously get in the way of achievement.
That's right. The source tackles some pretty fundamental psychological roadblocks. Specifically, it identifies a core trio it says we absolutely have to master:
Okay, what are they?
indecision, doubt, and fear.
Indecision, doubt, fear. Okay, so how does the source see the relationship between those three? It feels like they're linked, almost like a progression.
Exactly. That's how the material presents it. Indecision is the initial seed, the starting point where things begin to stall.
That little pause that can balloon into a real problem.
Precisely. That indecision, according to the source, then starts to, well, crystallize. It sort of solidifies into D-out BT.
Okay, so first indecision, then doubt takes shape. And once they're both present,
That's when they blend together, they merge, and the source basically says that combination is fear.
and the danger, as the source points out, is that this whole process can be really slow and subtle.
Yeah.
You might not even notice indecision turning into doubt and then doubt becoming this full-blown fear until it's really, taken root.
Right. They become this insidious trio
Yeah.
precisely because they can develop kind of beneath your awareness.
Right.
The source is very clear. If you want to embrace philosophies that lead to success, to achievement, your mind must be prepared.
Prepared how? By clearing out these three enemies.
Exactly. The source even suggests that a crucial internal faculty, it calls this the sixth sense, it suggests this simply cannot function properly if your mind is cluttered up with indecision, doubt, and fear.
Wow. So our mission today then is to really understand these core enemies.
Right.
Shine a spotlight on where they come from, maybe how they show up, and what the source suggests we can do about them. It's about getting a handle on these basic fears.
Yeah, and the source takes a very practical approach here, almost like studying an opponent in a game. It says to master an enemy, you absolutely have to know its name, its habits, and where it likes to reside, its hiding places.
Mm.
And fear. It can hide, often really subtly, deep in the subconscious mind.
This is where the source makes a really powerful statement, isn't it? It kind of cuts right to the chase and says fears are simply states of mind.
And what's critical about that definition is what comes next. A state of mind is something inherently subject to your control, to your direction. This is a core principle the source really hammers home.
It uses a pretty vivid example for this: physicians. The source observes that physicians seem less susceptible to disease than, say, the general population, even when they're directly exposed to highly contagious stuff.
Yes, and it attributes this, largely, or maybe even solely, to their absolute lack of fear concerning the disease itself. They just don't fear it, and this state of mind, according to the source, acts as a kind of immunity.
That really underlines the potential power of controlling your mental state, doesn't it?
It really does.
The source then connects this to a really fundamental idea about how our reality gets shaped.
It puts forth this principle. Man doesn't create anything, absolutely anything, that wasn't first conceived as a thought impulse in their mind.
Okay, so thought comes first. That makes sense. But then it adds something even more significant, I think.
It does. It makes the case that man's thought impulses begin immediately to translate themselves into their physical equivalent, their physical counterpart. And this happens whether those thought impulses are, voluntary or involuntary, intentional or not.
Whoa, hold on. So even thoughts we didn't deliberately choose, maybe ones we just sort of pick up from others, what the source calls tramp thought impulses, floating around, they can start shaping our destiny, our reality.
That's the implication, yeah. The source argues these can influence your path in, well, any area of life, just as surely as your own planned, deliberate thoughts. And it highlights that nature gave humans absolute control over only one thing.
And that's thought.
That's thought. So mastering fear is directly, fundamentally about mastering that one area of control you actually possess.
Because if thoughts automatically translate into their physical equivalent, well, then filling your mind with thoughts of fear and poverty simply cannot result in courage and financial gain. It's like oil and water.
Exactly. They're on opposite trajectories. They just don't mix.
It even uses a historical example to make this point, talking about the period after the 1929 crash.
Yes. It suggests that the collective mind of America at that time began to dwell on poverty, and that persistent, widespread thought gradually, sort of, materialized into the physical condition we know as the Great Depression.
And the source claims this happened in conformity with natural laws, reinforcing its view that thought literally creates physical reality.
So if thought is this powerful, and fear is just a controllable state of mind, What are the main forms this enemy takes? The source identifies 6 basic fears, it says, are, well, pretty much common to everyone.
The foundational fears, essentially. It notes that most people experience some combination of these, right? And many suffer from all of them at various times.
Right. And listed in the order, the source suggests they most commonly appear they are. First, the fear of poverty.
Okay. Poverty.
Second, the fear of criticism.
Criticism, yeah, that's a big word.
Third, the fear of ill health.
Ill health. Makes sense.
Fourth, the fear of loss of love of someone.
Oh, yeah.
Painful.
Fifth, the fear of old age.
Old age.
And sixth, the fear of death.
Poverty, criticism, ill health, loss of love, old age, death. The big 6. And the source basically lumps all other fears under these main headings, right? It mentions things like fear of ill health spiking after World War I because of the flu epidemic, suggesting prevalence can kind of cycle.
Exactly. So let's zoom in on the first one, the fear of poverty. The source really doesn't pull any punches here. It calls it the most destructive and the hardest one to conquer.
And it has a really stark take on it, doesn't it? Like zero tolerance. Absolutely. It states there is no compromise between poverty and riches. None. They move in opposite directions. If you're aiming for riches, the source says you have to flat out refuse to accept any circumstance that pushes you toward poverty.
It connects this back to the power of desire, which was apparently discussed earlier in the material. This chapter on fear, it says, prepares the mind to actually use that desire effectively.
And it throws this challenge directly at you, the listener. Are you willing to accept poverty? If you demand riches, you need to define exactly what form and how much. The source implies its philosophy provides the map, but whether you start the journey or finish it, that's your responsibility.
It circles back to that core idea fear of poverty is just a state of mind, but one powerful enough to completely derail your chances of achieving anything significant.
Yeah, and the source provides this truly extensive list of the negative effects of this fear. It's
Yeah.
quite something. Instead of reading through the whole exhaustive list, let's just highlight a few that the source really emphasizes. It talks about this fear-killing imagination.
Yeah, that jumped out at me. Imagination and self-reliance. Initiative.
Right. Those seem particularly critical for anyone trying to achieve something.
Hmm.
It also mentions it encourages procrastination, big time, and makes self-control nearly impossible.
Wow. It sounds like it just shuts everything down.
Pretty much. And it says it takes the charm right out of your personality, destroys accurate thinking, and even undermines fundamental traits like persistence and willpower. The source paints this picture of the fear inviting failure in countless forms, assassinating finer emotions, and leading to real misery and unhappiness.
It contrasts this pretty sharply with the reality of living in a world the source describes as having an overabundance of everything the heart could desire. It suggests the main barrier between us and our desires is simply a lack of a definite purpose.
And it delves into the origin of this fear. It attributes it to this long-standing human tendency, not preying on others physically, like animals might, but doing so economically.
Huh. Economically.
Yeah. It says man seems to get some kind of satisfaction from eating others financially. A pretty harsh assessment.
It even reflects on its contemporary age being marked by money madness, where people are judged solely by their bank accounts, sometimes, regardless of how that money was actually acquired.
And it speaks with real feeling about the suffering and humility poverty imposes, suggesting only those who have lived through it truly understand. There's a sharp line in the source about how some people simply cannot be trusted when it comes to money or possessions. It even notes the unfortunate reality of many marriages being primarily motivated by wealth.
The source includes this incredibly moving, almost visceral section from Westbrook Pegler that really captures the essence of this fear.
Oh, it really brings it to life, doesn't it?
Oh.
Pegler describes how money itself is just symbols, right? But being broke fundamentally impacts the spirit, your whole being. He talks about how you can see it in a man, the physical droop of his shoulders, the way he sets his hat, his walk, his gaze.
That feeling of inferiority he mentions, around people who have jobs, even if you know you're their intellectual equal.
Exactly. And friends start to see you as a casualty. And the act of borrowing just to survive is inherently depressing. That borrowed money, Pegler says, just doesn't have the power to revive your spirits the way money you've actually earned does.
He contrasts this with women who he suggests often hide their despair more effectively, maybe even to the point of suicide, because they don't typically resort to begging like men might in that era.
And he paints that picture of just aimlessness, being down and out, just walking, looking in store windows at things you can't have, seeking refuge in public places like libraries or train stations. But that very aimlessness gives you away, even if you're wearing clothes from better days. The droop, he calls it.
It's such a raw depiction, and he concludes that it's just money that makes this difference, allowing a man to be himself again. And then he includes these details that show how this vulnerability is just exploited.
Yeah, the examples of employers offering miserable wages are shocking. $12, $15, maybe $18 a week if you were lucky, which was incredibly low even then.
And that specific sandwich shop ad Pegler mentions needing a penman for 3 hours a day for $8 a month. And then having the brutal effrontery, as he puts it, to ask their religion. It just drives home the level of indignity the source associates with this fear and the state of poverty it describes.
After presenting all that, the source brings it right back to the core idea. Overcoming this fear, this specific state of mind, requires creating a different state of mind. It's something you assume, you embody, not something you buy.
And the source gives several examples of how this fear shows up, right? Things like expecting poverty, hanging out with others who accept it, but also those core elements we talked about earlier, like indifference, indecision, doubt, worry, and that excessive overcaution.
Exactly. Symptoms to watch out for.
Okay, let's move to the second fear. The fear of criticism. The source says this one is almost as widespread as the fear of poverty.
Yeah, nearly universal. It touches on things like politics or fashion as arenas where this fear plays out, but its primary explanation for its origin is that inherited tendency to prey we mentioned.
The economic preying.
Well, maybe broader than just economic here, but coupled with a need to justify that predation by criticizing the victim, like a thief criticizing the person he stole from.
Or politicians tearing down opponents. That feels familiar.
Exactly. It gives some examples that feel a bit dated now, maybe, but they make the point about social conformity driven by this fear, things like men wearing hats in certain ways, or this subtle pressure around changing clothing styles year after year.
The source asks you to imagine wearing a hat from, like, 1890 down the street today. That highlights how powerful that fear of being judged or laughed at can be.
For sure. And it points out how entire industries, like fashion and automobiles, really capitalize on this. They change styles constantly, encouraging people to buy the latest, not necessarily because it's objectively better, but because they fear criticism if they don't keep up.
But the source emphasizes the more important impacts, doesn't it? Beyond just fashion choices. It argues this fear prevents people from speaking their minds on controversial topics, even things like openly questioning religious fables, for instance.
It mentions the historical reality of people being burned at the stake simply for expressing disbelief in things like ghosts. That's the extreme end of how this fear could manifest historically, the ultimate criticism leading to death.
Scary stuff. It states clearly that this fear robs people of their initiative, their imagination, individuality, and self-reliance, basically the things you need to succeed.
And it touches on the damage done within families, arguing that constant criticism from parents can inflict lasting harm on children, creating these deep-seated inferiority complexes. The source contrasts this harmful criticism, which it says is often freely given, especially by relatives, and should be a crime for parents, with constructive suggestion, which actually encourages people. Criticism, the source says flatly, plants fear.
What are some symptoms here? The source lists several. Self-consciousness stands out, that nervousness or timidity you feel when you think you're being judged.
Right, and it links it to personality issues like maybe not having definite opinions or always agreeing with others just to avoid potential criticism. Hedging your bets.
It also mentions the inferiority complex this fear creates, which can manifest in surprising ways, like maybe boasting or using overly complex language, sometimes even acting superior, as a way to mask that underlying fear of being criticized.
Yeah, overcompensating, and that classic symptom, extravagance, trying to keep up with the Joneses, purely out of fear of being seen as less than others, all driven by fear of criticism.
Okay, on to the third fear, the fear of ill health. Where does the source say this one comes from?
It points to a few sources: physical and social heredity, meaning it can be passed down genetically or learned from society. It's also associated closely with the fears of old age and death. And interestingly, the source notes that the business of selling health itself contributes to this fear.
Selling health, how does that work?
Well, by constantly highlighting potential illnesses, symptoms, miracle cures, remedies, it can make people overly conscious and fearful of getting sick. Think about advertising for medicines.
Ah, right. Creating the fear to sell the solution. And the root reasons for the fear itself. Why are people so afraid of being sick?
The source points to the terrible pictures people have in their minds about what happens during serious illness and its aftermath, suffering, decline, coupled with the economic burden it can place on you and your family, the cost of care, loss of income.
Here's a pretty startling statistic from the source. It cites a physician estimating that as much as 75%, three-quarters, of people who visit doctors are suffering from hypochondria, basically imaginary illness.
That detail really drives home the power of the mind here, doesn't it? And the source explicitly states this powerful link. The fear of a disease, even if there's no physical cause, can actually produce the physical symptoms of the very disease you fear.
So you can essentially think yourself sick.
That's what the source is strongly implying. It notes this is precisely how fortunes were built in the patent medicine industry back in the day, by playing on people's fear of illness.
It gives a great historical example about the NYC mayor during the World War I flu epidemic.
Yes, it claims he significantly checked the spread of the epidemic, not just through medical means, which were limited then, but by actively suppressing scare headlines in the newspapers, banning the fear-mongering. This, the source argues, demonstrated the immense power of suggestion in either triggering or curbing fear-induced physical responses on a mass scale.
It even mentions suggestion experiments, like repeatedly telling someone, wow, you look terribly ill, could genuinely make them feel unwell, and it touches on the idea of hexing used by some groups, implying a similar power of suggestion at play.
The source reiterates that illness sometimes starts as a negative thought impulse, whether it's suggested by others or self-created. It quotes a wise man who, when asked how he felt, apparently felt the urge to just knock the questioner down, suggesting even that simple query can plant a seed of negative focus on health.
It notes that factors like changing climate can help health, partly by shifting your mental attitude. But negative states like worry, fear, discouragement, or disappointment in love or business can make the seed of this fear grow stronger. The source observes that even the business depression kept doctors busy not just with physical ailments, but with conditions stemming from negative thinking, stress-related illness, essentially.
And there's that remarkable anecdote about the young man, the one who became severely ill after a love disappointment.
Right. How did that resolve again?
The source says he was cured through suggestive therapeutics, specifically mentioning a nurse making love to him as part of a prearranged treatment plan.
Wait, really?
That's what the text says. They later married, and both remained healthy. It's certainly an unusual example, maybe even ethically questionable by today's standards, but it highlights the source's strong view on the mind-body connection and the power of suggestion, even in extreme cases.
Symptoms of this fear often involve autosuggestion, right? Like constantly looking for symptoms, maybe even kind of enjoying the attention of an imaginary illness, trying every fad or remedy out there.
Yes, exactly. And hypochondria, constantly focusing on potential disease to the point of potential breakdown. The source says this specifically needs positive thought to cure. It also includes avoiding exercise, worrying excessively about medical bills, and what it calls self-coddling, sort of feigning illness to get sympathy, or maybe as an alibi for not doing things.
And sadly, sometimes turning to intemperance, using alcohol or drugs, instead of dealing with the underlying fear or the actual cause of the worry.
Right, or just simply worrying constantly after reading medical articles or those patent medicine ads.
Okay, let's look at the fourth fear, the fear of loss of love. The source's explanation for its origin is quite blunt.
It is. It attributes it directly to what it calls man's polygamous habit, the tendency, historically perhaps, to try and steal mates or take liberties within relationships, basically infidelity or the potential for it.
It notes this is often the most painful fear and can cause immense damage, even leading to permanent insanity in extreme cases, linking jealousy to a state it calls dementia precox, which, in the era this was written, was an outdated term sometimes used for what we might now understand as severe mental disturbance, like perhaps related to schizophrenia.
It traces us back to ancient times where brute force was used to take mates, noting that while modern methods might differ, perhaps using charm or money or other forms of persuasion, the underlying dynamic of using some kind of force or advantage remains.
And the source finds women are often more susceptible to this particular fear. Why?
It explains this by suggesting it stems from women's historical experience and perhaps a general societal pattern, leading to distrust that men will remain faithful, particularly when rivals are present. An inherited or learned caution, maybe.
Symptoms listed include intense jealousy, often leading to suspicion without any real grounds, constantly accusing infidelity, and a general lack of faith in anyone.
It also mentions fault-finding, constantly picking at the partner, and desperate behaviors like gambling, stealing, cheating, or overspending, driven by this misguided belief that love can somehow be bought or secured through material means or risky behavior.
Other symptoms include insomnia, nervousness, a lack of persistence or willpower, poor self-control, and just a generally bad temper, all stemming from that fear.
The fifth fear is the fear of old age. What does the source say people actually fear here? What's under the surface?
It's a mix of things, really. Fear of others taking your wealth and possessions as you become less able. Those terrible pictures of the afterlife, often influenced by social conditioning or religious dogma. The possibility of declining health, naturally. Diminishing sex appeal, or what calls eroticism. The specter of poverty in later years, the classic poorhouse fear. And maybe fundamentally, the loss of freedom or independence.
But the source challenges the common negative perception of aging, doesn't it?
It does, quite strongly. It states that a person's most useful and productive years, mentally and spiritually, are actually between 40 and 60, directly contradicting the idea that you peak much younger and it's all downhill from there.
That's an interesting perspective. What symptoms does it associate with this fear, then?
Well, a tendency to slow down prematurely, maybe around 40 or 50, developing an inferiority complex about age, or a sort of false modesty about one's capabilities just because of the number, speaking apologetically about your age, oh, I'm getting old, instead of recognizing and being grateful for the wisdom and understanding that supposedly comes with it, according to this source.
Right. It suggests people actually kill their own initiative and imagination simply by thinking they are too old. And it also mentions the symptom of trying too hard to appear younger, maybe through dress or mannerisms, which the source says often just invites ridicule anyway.
Finally, the sixth basic fear, the fear of death. The source describes this one as perhaps the cruelest, at least for some people.
And it lays the blame for this fear, or at least its intensity, directly on religious fanaticism. It makes a striking claim that those considered heathen in that era were often less afraid of death than those considered civilized, who had perhaps been exposed to more terrifying religious doctrines.
It points to those age-old fundamental questions humanity has always pondered. Whence? Where did I come from? And whither? Where am I going after this life?
And it highlights how, throughout history, cunning and crafty people, as it calls them, have offered answers to these profound questions, usually for a price.
Yeah, it evokes that image of someone saying, come into my tent, embrace my faith, pay your dues, and I'll give you a ticket straight away into heaven, exploiting that existential uncertainty.
It really focuses on the power of the threat, use the concept of eternity being incredibly long and fire being terrible. The source argues the thought of eternal punishment can paralyze reason, destroy interest in life itself, and make genuine happiness impossible. It even mentions reviewing a book listing 30,000 gods humans have worshipped, underscoring how varied and often fear-based these historical beliefs could be.
The source's point seems to be that this lack of certain, positive knowledge about what happens after death creates a vacuum. And that vacuum opens the door for charlatans, deception, what it calls legerdemain and pious fraud, and trickery.
Though it does note this fear is perhaps less prevalent now, or was becoming so when written. It attributes that shift to the influence of science, colleges, universities in dispelling what it calls the fears of the Dark Ages. Still, it sadly mentions that many people in insane asylums at the time were believed to have been driven mad, specifically by this fear of death and damnation.
Its stance on this fear is ultimately quite pragmatic, isn't it? It basically says, it's useless, death is inevitable, it comes to everyone. So the source suggests you simply accept it as a necessity, like breathing.
And here's where it brings in that concept from elementary physics. It states the world is made of energy and matter, right? And the principle is that neither can be created nor destroyed, only changed in form, transformed.
Applying this to life, the source reasons that if life is a form of energy which seems plausible, then it cannot be destroyed either. It can only pass through transition or change. Therefore, death, from this perspective, is mere transition, not an end, but a change of state.
And if, for some reason, you don't accept that idea of transition, the alternative the source offers is that death is simply a long, eternal, peaceful sleep, which it concludes is nothing to be feared. It encourages the listener to use this perspective, one way or the other, to effectively wipe out this fear forever.
So acceptance, or reframing it as transition or peace, what's the ultimate remedy the source suggests? It seems tied to living.
Very much so. It's about cultivating a burning desire for achievement, especially when that achievement is backed by useful service to others. Someone who is truly engaged, busy, absorbed in living a purposeful life, the source argues, finds life too thrilling and absorbing to spend time worrying about dying. They're too busy living.
Symptoms of this fear include, obviously, dwelling on death instead of life, and how this fear often links up with others, like worrying about leaving loved ones in poverty, fear of poverty, or how it can be caused or worsened by ill health, fear of ill health, lack of purpose, disappointment in love, or those external influences like religious fanaticism we discussed.
Now, let's loop back to worry for a second, because it connects all these fears. The source describes worry as a state of mind fundamentally based on fear. It works insidiously, subtly, to paralyze reason, confidence, and initiative.
And it makes that crucial link again. Worry is a form of sustained fear, and its direct cause, indecision. But because it's a state of mind, the source insists it is controllable.
Indecision leaves your mind unsettled, anxious, helpless. The source observed that people often lack the willpower to make prompt decisions, especially during uncertain times like economic unrest, leading to what it calls mass indecision. A whole society frozen by worry.
And here's the source's powerful antidote for both indecision and the worry it creates: prompt and firm decision. It's presented as an individual responsibility. You have to apply it yourself. Nobody can decide for you.
The logic is straightforward.
Yeah.
You stop worrying about conditions once you've committed to a course of action, even if the action is just acceptance. Decision resolves the uncertainty that fuels worry.
It tells this really striking story about a man about to be executed by electrocution. The source notes he was the calmest person in the room. Why?
Because he had made the decision. He decided to accept his fate. There was no more indecision, no more what if.
And that decision brought him resignation and peace, allowing him to eat his last meal heartily. The source uses this intense example to show the power of decision, even in the face of the absolute inevitable.
And it argues that decision can be used not just for resignation to the inevitable, but also to prevent the acceptance of unwanted circumstances in the first place. You decide not to accept poverty, for example.
The 6 basic fears, the source says, are translated into worry primarily through indecision. So the path to conquering each fear then involves reaching a decisive conclusion about it, making up your mind.
Exactly. Fear of death. Decide to accept it as inescapable or as transition or peace. Put the worry aside. Fear of poverty or criticism. Decide you will simply not worry about what others think, do, or say. Decide their opinions don't control your state of mind.
Fear of old age. Decide to accept it as a valuable phase bringing wisdom, not just decline. Fear of ill health. Decide to stop dwelling on symptoms and focus on wellness. Fear of loss of love. Decide that you are capable of getting along without it if necessary, that your worth isn't solely dependent on it.
And the source offers a kind of master decision, a general blanket decision, that nothing life throws at you is worth the price of worry. This single decision, it claims, brings incredible poise, peace of mind, calmness, and ultimately happiness.
Beyond the internal impact, the source also talks about how a mind full of fear doesn't just hurt the individual. It can transmit destructive vibrations to others. It uses the relatable example of how animals like a dog or horse can sense fear in their master and react to it. They pick up on it.
It introduces the idea of mental telepathy as a reality, suggesting thoughts can travel from one mind to another through some form of ether, voluntarily or not, much like radio waves. A bit out there for some, maybe, but that's the concept presented.
And it warns about a destructive kickback, a boomerang effect that results from expressing negative or destructive thoughts or impulses, whether through words or even just strong feelings.
The damage here is significant, according to the source. It breaks down your creative imagination, helps you develop a negative personality, which naturally repels people and creates antagonism. And most critically, it imbedes these negative thoughts deep within your subconscious mind, making them a part of your character, your default state. You're not finished with a negative thought just by thinking or saying it. It spreads its influence and circles back to affect you deeply.
Which brings us to what the source calls the 7th basic evil. This isn't presented as a fear itself, but something maybe more fundamental, more insidious.
Right. It's described as a rich soil in which failure can easily grow, and potentially more deeply seated and fatal than the 6 fears themselves.
What's it called?
Its name is susceptibility to negative influences. The source starkly claims that people resigned to poverty almost never resist this, while successful people absolutely must. And it requires careful, honest self-analysis to even recognize it in yourself.
It's subtle then. It can strike when you're unaware, asleep or awake even, and its weapon is intangible, just a sleight of mind induced by others. It can come from many places, even seemingly well-meant words from your own family, or maybe your own internal negative chatter amplified by external cues. The source calls it a deadly poison.
And the most common weakness, according to the source, is simply leaving your mind open and undefended against the negative influences of others, just letting it all in. Most people, it suggests, don't even realize this is happening or try to correct it until it's become an ingrained, uncontrollable habit. They're just soaking up negativity.
So how does the source recommend we actively outwit these enemies, the fears, the indecision, and the susceptibility? It emphasizes using willpower, conscious effort.
Yeah, if your mind is becoming, as it puts it, a devil's workshop, constantly influenced by indecision or external negativity, the source says you need to constantly use willpower to build a wall of immunity, to filter what comes in.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
It suggests, first, recognizing your own nature, your potential for laziness, indifference, your specific susceptibilities to suggestions that match your weaknesses, and your openness to those 6 basic fears. Know yourself. Then, deliberately set up habits that counteract those fears and weaknesses.
And recognize that negative influences often work subconsciously. So you have to consciously keep your mind closed against people who are discouraging or overly negative. Choose your influences carefully.
It even gives a very specific, almost symbolic action. Clean out your medicine chest, throw away all pill bottles, and stop pandering to colds, aches, pains, and imaginary illness. Like a physical act to reinforce a mental shift away from the fear of ill health. Take control.
And deliberately seek out the company of people who influence you to think and act for yourself. People who foster independence and positive thinking, not dependency and fear.
Also, a simple but powerful piece of advice from the source. Do not expect troubles. Because, it says, they have a tendency not to disappoint you if you do expect them. You find what you look for.
Bringing it all back to the beginning. Achieving success, which the source defines broadly. Not just material gain, but peace of mind, having your needs met. Happiness, it all starts as thought impulses.
And the profound power the source highlights again and again is that you can control your own mind. You get to choose the impulses you feed it. And with that control comes the responsibility for the results. By controlling your thoughts, the source claims, you become the master of your own earthly destiny.
So it presents it as 2 clear paths, doesn't it? Either you use this privilege, this power of thought control, to consciously shape your life.
Or you neglect it, leave your mind open, drift in indecision, and get tossed around by circumstance, as it calls it, like a chip tossed on the waves, no direction of your own.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has taken us through some really core internal barriers highlighted in the source material indecision, doubt, the 6 basic fears, and that subtle 7th evil, susceptibility to negative influences. We've explored how they manifest, often subtly, and the source's powerful suggestions for confronting and overcoming them.
Yeah, the fundamental message distilled from this material is incredibly clear, isn't it? Your control over your own thought, and therefore your state of mind, is the most critical tool you possess for navigating these challenges and shaping your life.
The source definitely stresses the importance of careful self-analysis to even identify these fears and influences within yourself first. You can't fight an enemy you don't know is there.
Absolutely. So, based on this material's really strong emphasis on decisive action and personal control over your mental state, here's maybe a thought for you, the listener, to consider. If your state of mind truly is the primary force shaping your destiny, what is one small, decisive step or mental choice you can make today to begin taking back control from indecision, doubt, or fear?
Just one thing. How might consciously choosing your thoughts, starting right now, even in a small way, begin to reshape your reality?
Something to reflect on.
Definitely. Spend some time reflecting on that. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into some powerful and maybe challenging ideas.